Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by Professor of Kinesiology at Simon Fraser University and the owner of CoachBott.com, Carmen Bott. Carmen holds a master's degree in exercise science. She's a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a practicing kinesiologist. As a physical performance coach, she has over 20 plus years of experience, all the way from learn to train level athletes to professional. Carmen has evolved into an international speaker and educator. She's sought after for her methodology and coaching tactics in preparing both combat sport athletes and repeat sprint team sport athletes. So really interesting conversation. We speak to Carmen about education, where we're at educating young strength coaches / kinesiologists. Are we too heavy in the theory at the expense of the application point? Where are we in that whole process? We speak about an ebook that she wrote called Understanding Performance and Adaptation. We dive a little bit deeper into physiology. We speak about jump training. And finally, a new resource that she's created called her ACL course. It's really, really interesting, very, very bright. And I think one of the things that I'm excited about sharing with the audience is how heavy she relies on the practice, the real trenches, the coaching element. Obviously, she's very smart in terms and measures of her science and looking at the research. But Carmen is fantastic at taking that and putting it in a user-friendly version and also understanding the demarcation at times between the actual research and what goes on the floor, on the ice, on the field, etc. And I respect that a great deal. Hopefully that you can hear that through the course of this conversation. It's a fantastic conversation. Really hope you guys really enjoy it. Please give me a favor. If you do, rate the podcast on iTunes and share it with colleagues, coaches, and performance professionals alike. Welcome to the show. Carmen, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Happy to be here.
We are virtual friends from a distance, but first time meeting, at least through Zoom. Big fan of yours. I like the way you think, Carmen. I like the way you critically appraise information, and you're no BS person. And probably most importantly, I got to give you a compliment. I'm speaking from my own bias here, but you're heavy in the application and not a lot in the verbal diarrhea, for lack of a better word, of all the theory, if that makes any sense. So I want to start by giving you a compliment.
Thank you.
Simon Fraser, you're teaching several classes. I'd like you to discuss kind of what you're teaching, but I want to piggyback that and asking, where are we in terms right now of educating young performance coaches, strength and conditioning coaches? Do you feel we're preparing coaches for the field ahead? It's a big field. Right now, kinesiology, 24th most popular degree in America, over 25,000 undergraduates each year, and that's probably poor. This is from a site called authority.org. But where do you feel we are in terms of that education process?
That's a great question. It's a broad field. So I guess I'll start by saying I teach predominantly 3 sort of courses. A first year exercise prescription course where we get right into prescribing using sort of that FIT acronym, right? That's where you would maybe start a young first year student. And then of course they write a paper designing a program for themselves. They go through some testing. They have to look at their own data. They have to justify, hey, this is why I need to strength train versus do more endurance work or whatever. So I actually co-authored the textbook for that course with a mentor of mine, Tony Leland, who is now retired. And that textbook is just called Exercise Programming, Science, and Practice. And then there's a course in third year that the students also take that builds on that course. We don't use the same textbook. We start to get into more of the literature. So it's reading PDFs, reading meta-analyses and whatnot. And the students that course is unique because the students are tested orally in that course, meaning they come into the lab and I ask them, maybe 5 or 6 questions out of a potential 80. Different testing protocols, why they would use this test, what are we looking for, how is the test conducted, and they're with a partner. So one partner is the subject or the participant, the other person is the coach or the practitioner. So that I think that prepares students for the real world, and I think that needs to possibly happen more frequently in undergraduate degrees. Now the other piece is that kinesiology is broad. So a lot of students taking that as their undergrad is a stepping stone to get into PT because they think that that's it. That's the only thing I need, I'm going to be doing. That's the only thing I know about. Yet, students can do all kinds of things with a kinesiology degree. You could even go and become a physical education teacher, which we need more of. You could become a strength and conditioning coach. So the whole performance piece is an interesting topic because I think majority, and this is after speaking to lecturers from other universities, the majority of us teach as if the people graduating are doing active rehab or exercise-based rehab.
Okay.
Right? An exercise prescription for general population. Because then when we get into things like high performance, we get into things like clinical, like cancer patients or people with heart disease, more training is required. But
Sure.
there's a lot of options out there for young individuals to take continuing education courses and whatnot. So I think it's about exposing good programs. I think expose the students to a variety of professional settings. And I
Yeah.
always tell students, pick the setting you want to work in, right? Because do you want to be a PT and see, 8 patients a day or 20 patients a day, depending on the clinic, that are all motor vehicle accidents? Is that what you want to do? And some people, yeah, that's what I want to do. Other people, like myself and yourself, I like to solve problems. So I'll get a very complicated case with that happens to be an athlete that might have an injury, like something chronic, or maybe has had something fairly catastrophic, like a meniscus and ACL. Or more recently, I've had youth athletes with eating disorders.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm working with pediatricians and that, so I'm pulling from, knowledge in many domains of kinesiology to do this type of work. I will go to bat for kinesiologists and that we tend to have the most training when it comes to exercise-based rehab, more so than a PT without the kin undergrad. But the drawback to the kin programs, at least where I am, is that because they take so much science as their first and second years, like physics, biology, they start to learn to think a certain way, meaning that there is an answer. There's an answer. If you do math, there is an answer. It's 5, right? Or
So true.
10 or whatever.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when you take someone like myself that came from forensic psychology, because that was my first sort of interest, you start to learn to think in the gray. You start to go, well, that we'd have debates. I remember in first year, like, could we rehabilitate a serial killer? Right? We'd be like in tutorial going back and forth. No, you can't. It's nature versus nurture, blah, blah, blah. And we'd all be discussing it. And there is no black and white. So the best coaches are the ones that live in the gray, that go, I don't know. I've actually never come across this before. I almost turned down a client recently because I said to her, this is scary for me. I don't think I can rehab you. I've never done this before. And she was awesome. She was insistent. No, I've heard about you. I'm seeing you. You're seeing me. You are seeing me, she said. And I went, okay, this is interesting. And so I took her on and she's doing really well. But I am insecure about my approach because I wasn't trained to be a physical therapist. I'm trained to be a coach. But what coaches intimately understand, I think, is human behavior. We understand load. We understand progression, very, very well, and motor learning and skill acquisition. Because most of us were athletes, right? We
Sure.
were all jocks at one point. I'm just an old lady jock now. So it's like you think back to playing sport, like, how did I learn? How did I learn to catch a football? How did I learn to throw a football? Right. And it's just the same as, how am I going to teach this person that had hip replacement how to walk again?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's a pretty long answer, but do I think that universities are doing a good job? The answer is it depends. It depends who's teaching, because some teachers are researchers and
Yeah.
that's the world they live in, and others are practicing and teaching.
What a great answer, and a lot to unpack there. And I asked a broad-based question right off the start, but I want to unpack a couple things which I think are important. You said pick the setting. I really like that idea. And
Mhm.
and what we see at our gym, and we're in Columbus, Ohio, a different area, but we see a lot of really book smart people. And when you get on the floor, there's a demarcation between
Yeah.
theory and practice, right? I mean, you could recite a study, and then all of a sudden you get in front of an athlete, and you need to go to a plan B. The other thing I really like, and I am going to ask this, is this critical thinking aspect. I was an undergrad once too. I thought I had the answers to everything. And then I realized that as your island of knowledge grows, so does the shoreline of your ignorance. You got more questions than you ever. And they say too, I heard this, Carmen, it was hilarious. I was going through PhD studies and someone told me, said, you get smarter and smarter at one thing. So, and then you essentially, you're at a table and you can't even speak to anybody, right? Like you dig a hole so deep, right? You learn more and more about less. They say, here it is. You learn more and more about less and less until you absolutely everything about nothing. So I guess my question is for critical thinking. Do you think that's something that should be taught in undergraduate courses or graduate level courses? I know that's a loaded question. I think it's taught in England. I spoke to a couple.
Yes, it is.
PhD. Mm-hmm. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends. I might counter with what is critical thinking, right? Yep. And I guess the way I think about it, it's problem solving.
Sure.
And problem-based learning. So you flip it, right? So what you do is you give somebody a case. It's a mock case. And then you ask them to first identify and analyze the case. Like, what's the low-hanging fruit, right? So let's say you had a hockey athlete. They have chronic right shoulder instability. They are 29% body fat. So they're slow. Like they have a speed problem. They have a body composition problem. They smoke, and they're also an air traffic controller. I don't know. I'm just throwing like a whole shitstorm at your
sure.
listeners. But I'll do this to my students and then say, okay, you have to make a decision as to where we're going to start. And that is the part where everybody freezes, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. I don't know what to do. So then we teach them, okay, let's create a hierarchy. Is this person going to die? Right? So what would prevent them from death? And then we work and health, right? Because health is a foundation of performance. Then we work forward to performance. And then we ask questions around or I might even throw in something like the person doesn't like to go to the gym. They're an introvert and they are also in a hurry. They want to know how quickly they're going to get results, which is a typical client. Sure. I mean, maybe that's not a typical client. That's pretty extreme, but I will sort of come up with different cases. And so what the students do is they do the first step and then they come and meet with me. Sure. And I let them know if they're on track. So I help them through this problem solving. That's the thing. Like, you can't just expect someone to think critically without challenging them, but then supporting them through the process of critical thinking. Yep. Some people can, because some people are more curious and brave than other people by whatever nature, temperament, or the way they're brought up. Like I had a father that said, figure it out like 50,000 times a day. Right. But we're of the same generation. It was like, Carmen, I'm going to teach you how to catch. So you're going to back up a little bit more. Now put up your glove. Now catch. It was like, if I didn't make the right, come up the right solution to that problem, there would be a huge consequence, which I don't think necessarily is bad either. Yep. That there are consequences around making a decision that's not optimal. But we really want to try to teach these young practitioners how to think on their feet. And also the second part of that is the justification. So let's say you decide that this person has to quit smoking. That's like number one. Okay, then justify that. Or why losing body fat is going to help them with their speed. Because I get a lot of athletes asking me for speed development. And I'm not shy to say, well, first, the low-hanging fruit is you're actually not strong enough to run fast and you're not lean enough to run fast. Yep. So we're going to work on these two things first versus going straight to the turf to do like some, 2-point start with these like perfect angles. Who cares how perfect your angles are until we get rid of the body fat?
So I really like this idea. Actually, we have a 12-week summer internship at our facility, and it's capped off with a capstone project, which is a case study. And we give an individual, athlete X is coming back from a labral tear. He's XYZ apart from therapy. He's been cleared for this. His movement capacity looks like this, and this. Write a first phase block. And then we as a coaching staff, I say critique. I use that word loosely, but we guide, and they have to have some sort of reasoning behind that. And I liked what you said, it depends what your definition is. To me, that's an exercise in critical thinking, and the fact that you have to understand what the limitations may be, but you better be able to justify those limitations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like what you said about it being an exercise. I think we do need to exercise that part of our brain all the time if we want to be good at what we do.
Yep.
Right? If it's a formulaic or system and it's just this cookie cutter approach, you are going to be left behind in terms of people being better than you. Or you're just going to get cookie cutter kind of cases and not really have a transformational experience with your client versus a transactional experience.
Do you think more of that needs to be shared in strength and conditioning regarding rehab? I mean, a lot of people pull from the literature. Like I know you've talked about this in the past. Is like a lot of these case studies, like this might be a first for somebody coming in. You're not going to pull from anything. I remember listening to Doug Kachichian at Resilient speak many years ago, and he talked about the need for strength and conditioning professionals and physical therapists to share case studies, not just what worked, but more importantly, maybe what didn't work.
That's how I developed the Canadian national team with wrestling, to be honest. So what I did when I was hired with Wrestling Canada, I didn't know anything really about wrestling because I never wrestled, was a team sport person. So I took the contract and crossed both my fingers and my toes and went, all right, here we go. And then just took it upon myself to learn everything I could about the sport. And what I did was I read case reports from a journal that I was given access to. A lot of it had been translated from Persian to English or Russian to English. And I read about what the best in the world were doing. And they were men, right? Yep. And I remember learning this one study measured blood lactate levels post-match in world champions. It was a small study, like maybe 4 or 5 athletes, because I mean, you don't have 200 world champions.
Exactly.
But the common denominator was that they all had really low levels of blood lactate at the end of their match, which led me down a path to figure out how I could improve mitochondrial density and type 2 fiber in these athletes versus doing like sort of cyclical repetitive endurance work, which is what we did back in the 90s because we didn't know any better. What could I do with this population? And then I ended up working a bit with Pavel Tsatsouline, who wrote the Strong Endurance Manual. And I did a lot of article pulling for Pavel, but every time he would ask me to pull an article for him, I would read it because if Pavel's interested in this stuff, then so am I, and really came up with some interesting methods that were born out of purely reading case studies and nothing else, because there was nothing else published about how to develop the power endurance quality in these particular athletes, this population.
Wow. That's outstanding.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's a lesson for all of us. If you're passionate about something, dig into these things because what I'm learning too is, 20 years now, like yourself is, these case studies are really, really important. Also the information, like Dan Pfaff calls it the academic drop. A lot of the questions being answered from academia aren't questions that coaches need answered. It's nuts. It's another research question to be published, right?
Yeah. It's like, another HIIT training. I'm like, what do you mean by HIIT training? Like long intervals, short intervals? Like what was the work to rest? What percentage of max power are they working at? Like there's no definitive methodology. And so then you're publishing results. And what do the results even mean when we haven't been clear on what the prescription was or even how they did the drills? I'd like every article published to be published with a video library.
Yeah.
Because when you start telling me that they did plyometrics, so I'm reading this one article comparing plyometrics to isometrics, right? Because I wrote a coaching manual on that. And I'm skeptical about the use of isometric and the over-popularization of isometrics because I just don't think they do. They don't cure cancer. I do know that. So I'm reading this article and I'm looking at first the population are NARPs, right? So non-athletic recreational runners. And we all know who those people are. When they jog, it looks like, they're barely getting off the ground. It's like the height of a credit card. So they have no power, no strength. I mean, they have lungs and a vascular system that's like out of this world, but they're not powerful people. And they're doing it at the end of the intervention, they're doing like drop jumps, or single leg drop jumps or something like, and I'm just imagining, okay, I'm imagining a box 20 centimeters high and this NARP stepping off of it, hitting the ground. And then the sound effect is something like
Just,
this.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Because they're just spending like 2 hours on the
On the
ground
ground.
before they come up in the air again. And I'm going
Yep.
like, you could have them jump rope and that would improve their performance.
Sure.
So that's the problem with most of the research I read. And when I built my ACL course, I almost pulled all the hair out of my head, and I already have very fine hair.
Well, look at me.
I was almost looking like you. Yeah. Right? I was going to be bald. I'm like, God damn it. So yeah, it's frustrating because I don't think they're having conversations with coaches like you,
Yeah.
like, hey, when we do this design, I read another study recently. Well, I didn't read it. It was posted on Twitter. So I asked the researcher, well, was there a control group? What was the intervention? Because they were comparing isometric mid-thigh pull prior to doing maximal or near maximal power clean
Okay.
to a 70% max power clean before a maximal power clean as what's the better like way to potentiate. Well, duh, of course we're going to get better potentiation when you're doing something near maximal before you do something near maximal in the same like biomechanic, like the nature of the movements, the biomechanics are very similar. Like what athlete goes from 70% on a power clean to 95%? Right? I mean, you're laughing because we're both like, we don't do that. That
Yeah.
doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So why are we measuring this? And you look silly now because, Coach Bott is down your shorts going, that's like, I don't know. I guess maybe I've always been of the mind, like, I don't jump into things that I'm not super comfortable with. I'm not, don't have to be the best, but I think that we need more collaboration between the coaches and the research side for sure.
I agree. And
On
also,
performance.
too, you hit on a couple things. Like, I remember reading this a long time ago. I'm paraphrasing it, but this idea of being a skeptic, like a skeptic is a great thing. I interviewed Franco Impellizzeri. He's part of like a skeptic society.
Oh
He's got
yeah.
more gray matter than I do. He's a brilliant guy. But there's a big difference between being a pessimist and being a skeptic. A skeptic looks at the world and thinks why things may not be, as opposed to well, we just, it says this is what the science says, or this is what quote the journal article Etel says. Digging a little bit
Right.
deeper and asking those more difficult questions. I don't know if that
Absolutely.
I don't know if that
I
comes
think
from years of practice, academia. I don't know if it comes from a combination. I don't know where it comes from.
I think part of it is temperament because some people are more agreeable than others. I tend to not be. I tend to be more disagreeable, which is actually more of a male trait.
Yeah.
So I've always been kind of like a prove it to me sort of person. Like let me see it, show me
Yeah.
the money type,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I think that, and I do think it's a healthy way to approach things because people aren't going to pull the wool over your eyes and it makes you curious. And I think
Yeah.
if we can be more curious about what we see and potentially even maybe a little less polite, and I don't mean being rude, not by any means, but being questioning. Once this person had told me what the intervention was, of course I just thank them. You
Sure.
don't, oh, that's silly, da da da
Yeah.
da da. We all have something to learn. People in this realm could bury me in physics equations. I'd be
Yeah.
like, a little child on my back crying.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're all trying to learn stuff, but I think the coach is helping the researchers. Plus, I think the research being more holistic would help. So if you're designing a study, you pull in the motor behavior consultant, you pull in the biomechanics
Yeah.
consultant, you pull in the physiologist and the psychologist because we know in jump research, for example, people have to be highly aroused. So do we bring in the psychologist or the mental performance specialist to talk about like the inverted U hypothesis or what's optimal? Do we need them off the charts aroused where they're like smashing their forehead against the brick
Yeah.
wall? Or
Yeah.
do we need them just here? Or does it depend on the person? Right. So even biomechanical data, I'm so curious when they give this information on force plates, like I'm so curious how they jumped. I'm so curious how they warmed up because one of my students and I are writing a testing manual right now. And we have scoured the literature looking for a standardized warm-up prior to a counter movement jump. Do you think we can find a standardized warm-up?
I'm guessing no.
We cannot find a standardized warm-up. We finally found something of which I am going to review tomorrow morning. And hopefully that is going to be what we will use. And then I will tweet it out there to the world, and hopefully more people will use it. Because if we can all standardize the warm-up, then the data we're collecting is more reliable.
Sure. It's just really interesting. You bring up so many points, and I want to get on it. One of these, I promise, down the line here when we talk a little bit about return to sport. I want to talk about force plates. I want to slightly pivot here. Adaptation, the ebook that you had sent me, Understanding Performance and Adaptation. A lot of deep physiology in there. I want to ask a general question, and agree, disagree, or say it depends. I'm fine, but I'd love your explanation. I heard Patrick Ward a long time ago. Again, another guy, way smarter than me. And we use it at our gym when we talk to young coaches about this. We always say adaptation, method, and then the exercise. Don't think about the exercise first. What is the adaptation that I want to garner? What is the method I want to use to garner that? And then, and only then, am I going to pick a squat, a back squat, or do you agree, disagree? And if so, fill me in.
I couldn't agree more. That's precisely exactly the way that I think you chase the adaptation, right? And then, because if the adaptation is two-dimensional power, you're not going to jump or do plyos, you're probably going to use a bike, so that becomes your modality of choice. And so if I'm even doing a repeat sprint interval type routine for a wrestler, I might choose battling ropes because I'm chasing type 2 fiber mitochondrial development in upper body, right? So then that I'm not going to go, okay, I've got all my equipment in the gym here, and now I'm going to choose the workout based on the equipment I have. Now, obviously we have to work with equipment that an athlete would have access to. And I think that's also a good case study for students. Like, the athlete has access to nothing. It's COVID. Here I am telling guys to find cinder blocks, right? Do you have any cinder blocks near?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to do this stuff, right? So that's where I think the isometric train really took off.
Sure.
Because that might have been the best solution at that time. But I agree with you. Yeah, we want to look at why is that we're chasing endurance or power endurance or starting strength or acceleration. Like, what is it that we're after? And then what do we do to get there?
Talk to me a little bit, again, from a physiology side about this idea of jump training. And I want to get on a little bit more deeper as we further our conversation, specifically with return to sport. From a physiology standpoint, how you program, and I know it would depend. Let's talk about a hockey player, a healthy hockey player. Are you programming those based on their assessment, what you think they're lacking? Is it a 1 divided by n approach, meaning, hey, we're going to hit all ends of that kind of force velocity, meaning like higher impulse jumps during the course of the microcycle, true plyometrics, even higher impulse, which might be a lateral bound type? A lot of things to throw at you, but let's talk about a hypothetical case study, healthy hockey player. Is that adaptation that we're chasing based on the initial assessment, or is it more of, hey, we're going to give them, a bucket of stress, each kind of jump parameter throughout the course of the week, measure, manage as we go?
I view movement training, so plyometrics, as a skill.
Okay.
So because I view it as a skill, I assume majority of athletes are not exposed to good coaching in this area, that I may not choose to hit every point on the force velocity curve simply because they don't know how to bound,
Sure.
they don't know how to hop, and they don't know how to leap. And so I use a tiering approach where I might start an athlete bilaterally using leaping movements. So that's 2-foot takeoffs to 2-foot landings, to use Matt McGinnis's classification system, which I think is brilliant.
Okay.
And I might do drills that are have shorter ground contact times, but are done on turf, for example.
Sure.
All right. So something like a pogo leap is got short ground contact time. So it's more, quote unquote, a true plyometric.
Sure.
If we validate them based on the ground contact time. But if I have a I might have a hockey player that's highly trained, but they're untrained or a novice in the skill.
Sure.
So I'm probably going to expose them to plyometrics quite frequently during their training week. So that way they up their skill set in that area. But I'll pick drills that may not lie on that whole continuum, because some of the drills, like hopping, are extremely complex and more intense by nature because they are single leg takeoff to single leg
So,
landing.
sure.
And then I put bounding kind of in the middle of those two. As soon as we start moving in multi directions, the ground contact times will always change. They'll always be worse. But when we're training hockey players, we want them to be able to move in all directions. So then we rob Peter to pay Paul. We're like, fine, who cares about the ground contact? Plus, they're on ice. They don't need to dunk. So I'm not overly concerned about this idea of vertical ground reaction and mechanical loads in this vertical vector. I'm going to have them doing things like horizontally or working in the frontal plane and start getting really creative.
Sure.
Because I think that's important. And then I would be doing, especially early off season, I'd be doing a lot of deep tier plyometrics, which are not at all true plyometrics.
Sure.
They're very muscle dominant, not tendon dominant work, but phenomenal for building very specific capacity in the tissue, which in my opinion, collision sport, multi-directional team sport athletes need. And this is an opinion because I don't think this has been studied. If we were to choose between high VO2 and high peripheral endurance, which is muscle endurance in the lower body, I'm going to choose 10 times out of 10 the athlete with the higher peripheral endurance than the guy with the high VO2. Even though back in the day in hockey, I remember I had a guy that was playing for Florida, and Mike Keenan was the coach. Do you remember him?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And he'd be like, Carm, I have to have a VO2 of 70. He would tell me this. I'm like, on a bike.
Jeez.
In order to make the team. This guy, this is the funniest part about this guy. So this guy on a glute bridge had such well-developed glutes that his ass was still on the ground in a glute bridge. I mean, I'm sort of exaggerating. He didn't have very long legs, but he was just like all power. He was like a bowling ball. And I thought to myself, this is just, and even back then, this was 1999, 2000, somewhere around then. It was a long time ago, but I remember thinking like, this is, at that time, this is like kind of ridiculous.
Yep.
But this is what was required. Was he was obsessed with low body fat and high VO2s back then. So I know I'm digressing, but it's just showing your readership like the evolution. Things have improved exponentially in performance. And that's why guys and girls, not all guys and girls, but people are bigger, faster, stronger than they were 20 years ago, 100%. Yeah. But then people are also a lot more injured, adolescents especially. And I don't know what's happened with female athletes. I'm finding at least the ones that are coming to me, there's like a bimodal distribution. I'm either getting like, whoa, you're an absolute beast and you're 18, or wow, you play sport at this level and you are as weak as a kitten, right? So not that kittens aren't cute and cuddly, but they're not very strong, right? So, right? Yeah. It's just an interesting observation over time that I've kind of just noticed. That's all. I don't know what you've noticed.
No, I like this. I like what you talked about peripheral adaptation. I think I stole this from Alan Cosgrove. He said, you could argue that Lance Armstrong had one of the best VO2s ever, right? And he finished, I think, 754th in like the Boston Marathon. Like his peripheral adaptations, he wasn't made to run. He was made to bike. No. At any rate, I thought it was interesting. Let me ask you this question, kind of off the cuff, the way I view jump training, and I'd love you to pick this apart and help me learn, because this is your specialty in terms of physiology. The way I look at it, the way we look at it at our gym. So we have a group of what I would consider lower age demographic athletes. So high school kids, middle school kids. So they're just getting involved in jump training. And I use air quotes because I know people confuse jump training with plyometrics. They're not the same. If you want to talk about ground contact times in Soviet literature, I get it, but we're talking jump training. Okay. Then we have a group of highly trained guys that train in the summers that have had at least 10 years of training experience. Okay. They play at a high level. They make a living playing. The way that we view that kind of jump training for the younger kids is it's much more of a classic linear periodized approach. And to steal it from kind of the Mike Boyle-esque, right? I'm using, physics here. We use the kinetic energy equation, half of mass times velocity squared. And we just break that equation down. So essentially, we start by jumping onto a box, right? So it's jumping on a box, dissipating that, holding less and less of that eccentric pounding when you land, right? Then phase 2, they would jump over a hurdle or something small, and they would stick that landing. And then phase 3, they would jump over and pulse and get that little amortization phase. And then that last block would be what we would potentially call true plyometrics. And we, in this case, would really be looking at ground contact as opposed to hurdle height, much smaller hurdles, looking at being really hot off the ground. And we would bake that into a 12-week process for young athletes. And by the way, not just jumping, there would be a single leg component. There would also be a lateral component depending on the day. Now, take that and contrast that with the guys and girls that have trained a ton. And we have what we call a gain, go, and grow model, where we lift heavy things slowly. So it's a higher impulse plyo we pair that with, right? We have a go day where we're sprinting and we're doing true plyos. We're trying to complement the training, right? And then we have a grow day where it's even more higher impulse, where we're going to do some sort of bounding because there's more foot contact. And we're trying to pair the touch points with the weight room, although it's never going to be perfect, with the menu items in the gym, if that makes any sense. So we have two kind of different approaches. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I wrote a couple notes because my brain can't remember all that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm yapping here. I'm excited.
No, it's okay. Okay, so I guess I don't disagree with you. I think there are many ways to, skin a cat. There's another cat insult. I'm sorry, I know you're a dog person, so here we go. So back to your original point around chasing adaptation. So if the adaptation that I'm chasing, which is important, is deceleration, ability to decelerate, which is absorb and accept load,
sure,
in flight, then it makes sense to have this progression of physics where we jump onto something, jump over something, and then jump and pulse. I think you said, which is I remember Charlie Francis having like this red, yellow, and blue, looked like a grade 7th grader drew stick figure routine. That's also sort of, I think there's other people that talk about building like the eccentric control first and blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
I don't do that. I used to do that.
Okay.
I don't do that anymore. And the reason why is because I view all movement as something serial. So done one after the other. So to me, I do agree with you that jumping onto a box is a jump. And I do agree it's not a plyometric.
Sure.
But I would start with handling and harnessing landings as my number one priority right off the bat, no matter how young they are in terms of chronological age or maturational age. So I work with middle school kids, and my son's in middle school. So I work with him and his friends in the summer. I work with high school. So I worked last 2 years with the high school football program, but just the grade 9s and 10s. So those are like 14 and 15-year-olds with broccoli hair. And then I have my high school kids, that I also work with in a variety of sports. And then I always have, and I say this to myself every year that I'm not going to do this anymore, but I'm doing it again. I have a group of guys I'm preparing for a combine. Okay. So every winter I'm outside and I'm cold, Anthony. And I'm old and I'm cold and I'm freaking running around like a 25-year-old demonstrating drills and then hobbling home afterwards because I'm old. And anyway, so with like all of these groups, even though they're all different training age with different goals, obviously the complexity intensity of the drills with the higher age group are going to be of higher volume. So then the lower complexity, lower intensity drills are served as a warm-up. So my pro group are doing things like pogos and some skips and things, low amplitude skipping as their warm-up.
Sure.
And then we're progressing to bounding and hopping, quite potentially in the same session, and then into speed development. So I will do plyos and speed all in the same workout. And I agree with you in that as people physically mature, then the drill becomes more and more plyometric.
Sure.
It just does by practice. It's not like someone is all of a sudden going to just choose, oh, I'm an untrained novice, I'm going to do plyometrics. Actually, no, you're not. No, you're not.
Yep.
Right? Like
Yep.
if you really truly define it, but you are working on landing mechanics in series. And so I never use cones and I don't use hurdles. I don't use anything. Head is up. And I'm anal about this. And once I started doing more research in my ACL course and diving into some of the sensory motor literature, head position and eye position seems to be very important because it helps to facilitate the learning experience. And so anytime I put things on the ground, by default, people start looking down. I know I'm talking in circles, so let me circle back. So every age group I work with is exposed to different plyometric drills. The difference in intensity is dictated by the performance of that drill.
Got it.
So then what happens is that my pros are doing less volume. So their contacts in a hop, no joke, are probably 6 per set. My youth group, so my son Jackson, who's grade 8, him and his friends, they might do 12 hops or 15 hops down the track or down the turf, but they're literally, I call it a credit card hop. So it looks like they're jumping over like a bank card, right? So it's like they're barely moving, but I'm looking for certain shapes, right? I'm looking for improvement in how much the knee and the hip is flexing on those landings. And as we improve that stiffness in the tissue and we improve strength, because we can get really strong doing plyos, then we have improvements. So I don't use an extensive intensive approach. I don't subscribe to the idea that jumping onto a box has anything to do with any other bilateral leaping.
Yep.
I don't think that they're too different. It's sort of like saying if someone squats really well, then that means that they can deadlift really well. Well, no, they're actually different exercises and they do need to be instructed and taught. So that tends to be my approach.
Sure.
And it seems to be, from a speed perspective, especially if I stick with very sagittal plane plyos. Like if I am doing combine training, those guys are doing a lot of sagittal plane plyos because they have to do the 40. As ridiculous as that is, having D linemen run that far, but whatever. So I'll stick with a lot of skipping, which is vertical bounding, a lot of horizontal bounding. And Glenn Bruce is a friend of mine in Winnipeg. He actually trains a lot of pro hockey players and football, and he actually has been able to, over the years, quantify exactly the number of bounds it takes to cover 30 meters in how that actually correlates to 40-yard time. And it's almost down to a science. So I can't remember it off the top of my head. I'll text him after and I'll ask. Yeah, so I started using that as a metric with the professional athletes that I work with, like guys that do play in the CFL.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that need to be fast, right? That need to be speedy. But I would almost argue that some of the work that's jumping onto a box and then jumping over a hurdle and then jumping off of something and sticking and having the control, I would just put it into deceleration training.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough.
And that's how I would rehab someone's ACL.
Well, that's going to be a perfect pivot right now. But I wanted to hit on something really quickly before we get onto your ACL course, because I want to learn all about this and I want to share it with the listenership as well. One thing you mentioned is the volume, and you said, as my kids, we call it credit card hops or credit card jumps. They do 12, 15 jumps or hops, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to the pros who might do, 5 or 6. I just think it's interesting because I read this, it was probably a year and a half or 2 years ago. Boo Schexnayder wrote an unbelievable blog post, and I forget the name of the blog post, but he talked about injuries that are occurring in track. And he said, typically, I'm paraphrasing. I don't want to put this in Boo's mouth, but, essentially freshman, sophomore, they come in beating the world and then they get beat up or banged up and get injured junior, senior year. His working hypotheses is, well, they have a greater training age. They have to tip the homeostatic wire at greater loads, at greater thresholds. You can't have the same program for that, right? A pro or someone with a highly trained, it's like I always use the analogy, young 12-year-old Tommy has a golf cart engine. You know what? The pro who's got a 15-year training career has got a Ferrari engine. Guess what happens when you hit a telephone pole in a Ferrari? You can't have those volumes exposed because there's higher stress placed in the system, and in essence, their potential breakdown if you're using the same types of volumes. I thought it was an interesting analogy.
Right. Yeah, that is a
So
great analogy. And I would happen to agree with it.
yeah, yeah,
Like you can really break somebody that is twitchy and
yes.
trained. And so I'm actually paranoid, to be perfectly honest. I operate from a position of skepticism and pure paranoia. And that's like I'll obsess over something if I can't figure it out or I don't know, or I'll be super conservative on volume,
Yes. Yes.
and to the point where maybe I'm too conservative, because do we actually know exactly what a taper is or exactly how much less
I,
volume to do? We don't even know how many foot contacts there should be in plyometric workout. And I'm reading an article right now on the number of decelerations that occur in a soccer match, but that also depends on the level and the gender. So
yes.
there's just, we are guessing. Like, let's just be honest.
In my opinion, that's what we do. We're educated guessers, right? And
Educated guessers. Yeah.
and not to get too philosophic, but this ties back to our conversation before, talking about critique and criticism. When you're able to ask good questions and challenge in healthy ways, that creates better dialogue and creates better explanations. Science is the business of creating better explanations, better ways of thinking. Anyways, I'm rambling. I want to talk about
Oh, I
something
love
that
it.
you're passionate about here. Talk to
Sure.
me broad based, because I'm going to ask some targeted questions here. Talk to me about the ACL course. Talk to me about the impetus. Why'd you decide to do something like this? Talk to me a little bit about what it encompasses, and then I'm going to go more rifle-like approach and ask some questions.
Yeah, that's a great question because I have someone to thank for it. And this is a young physiotherapist, local guy who has built his practice rehabbing ACLs. And he used to book consults with me just to learn more about strength and conditioning. And then I got to know him. And so I invited him to my lab at the university to help me, because I do an ACL return to play lab in my third year course. We do all some of the testing, like the return to play testing.
Yep.
And we just became colleagues. And he said, you need to do more continuing education, Carmen. You need to do way more. You need to do a workshop. So I did a workshop because he told me to. And then I wrote that
Yep.
book that I sent you. And, because I do everything over the top, it's not like I'm just going to rock in and do a workshop. I'm also going to write like a 100-page manual.
Sure.
Why not? Right?
Yep.
Because I'm paranoid. And so then as the workshop evolved and we started chatting, he and I started chatting more. He's like, did you realize that there is no ACL rehab exercise plan to follow? And I said, yeah, I was kind of under that impression, but really? So I went into the literature and I looked, and I did come across a few researchers that some of them have done case studies, one case study in particular, but very few understand what we understand as S&Cs about things like training load and mechanical load and volume and strength standards. Like if you're going to progress someone out of late stage rehab into the return to play stage of rehab, if they can't do like 15 push-ups, like you still have a strength problem. And often the adolescents we are seeing with ACL surgeries have a severe strength problem. So their rehab is very strength based, and it's not enough to be standing on a wobble board or jumping on and off a BOSU or whatever they're doing in a clinical setting. And so I did some surveys, and I snuck into a group on LinkedIn, and I did. I was snuck in and I ran a survey, and they let me in. It was like a group of physios, and I had 256 respondents to a survey asking them, like, what is it that they feel the gaps are? And I just built my course based on their survey and the gaps that I was seeing.
What a great
And so
idea.
my
What a great
course
idea,
just,
by the way. What a great idea.
thank
That's
you.
right from the horse's mouth, right? Though, seriously, right?
I want to know, like, what do you think you need to learn? Like, tell me. And do I know everything? No. And even in my course, I'm very transparent in that we don't know how to return someone to play. Like, this guy says this guy says this girl says this. Nobody says, oh, this is it. It is literally a cauldron. And I also put quite a bit of psychology into the course as well. So talking about that part and the confidence piece. And there's lots of evidence to suggest athletes feeling confident doesn't mean they're physically ready. And athletes that are physically ready sometimes aren't at all confident. So what's that all about? Right? And why are we doing an RSI scale or tests of kinesiophobia? Why are we even doing these? Well, of course, someone's going to be kinesiophobic Wow. Whatever that word means.
Yeah.
If they can't even do a single leg squat with body weight, I'd be
Sure.
kinesiophobic too.
Yep. Yep.
Because why would I want to go and play flag football if I've been exposed to this and I can't do this? But then, learning how to do these things. And then what is the logical progression? And so the course itself, the students in it in the last cohort have homework every week, and most of the homework is exercise. All right,
That's
here's the routine. Go to the pool and run for 45 minutes in the deep end. Tell me how it was. That's the workout. Next workout, you're going to do 300 kettlebell swings in sets of 10 over a 20-minute time period. That's how many reps I need you to do. I have a girl right now that's been following one of my templates with kettlebell training for her rehab, and I saw her last weekend, and she's 6 months post-op, and her ability to hinge and get into that position and hold that position and hold tension and move just by doing kettlebell swings. And guess what? She got to go to practice while her teammates are practicing. She's just standing on the edge of the court doing kettlebell swings, so she can be involved in the sport and still train because it's just a kettlebell. You don't need
100%.
anything else.
From an
Yeah.
adaptational standpoint, I'm not trying to pick the pepper or the fly shit here when I ask, because I know you're big into swings and I like it. We swing as well. But for someone in earlier stages, or maybe it's later stages, is the swing really good for a combination of one of two things? Is it good to get the hinge pattern back in the hips, or is it also good for terminal knee extension at end range? Where you're also getting quad. Is it a little bit of both? Okay. I'm just curious.
Everything. There's just so much you can get from doing that one drill.
Yep.
That you can't get from so many other drills, right? And so many drills are focused on the hamstring in knee flexion and extension, not at the hip. Also, in earlier stages, not early stage, but earlier stages of rehab, we know scientifically there is less stress on the graft when the shin is vertical. So doing things like good mornings or box squats really early in the rehab process are actually much safer as the graft heals than doing like a knees over toes lunge, right? Which would come way later. And so things like lunging and step downs come actually in late stage rehab, whereas in mid stage rehab, we can do things like good mornings and swings. But that information doesn't seem to be available. So what I did was I basically analyzed all the physics of everything, and all the research is done on sheep. I think sheep ACLs, and putting like kind of like McGill's work where he did pig spines.
Yep.
He did sheep ACLs and just subjected these ACLs to all kinds of different loads to see which ones were the most stressful, and then they measured the loads in newtons and the forces on the ACL. And then what I did is I took all that information and I just paired all those loads with the different exercises and just basically built a continuum.
Wow. So
with that,
the course itself, how does it, if you, I don't want to, take the hood off the car and divulge everything, but what is it broken down into? So for listeners that are interested in it, I'll hyperlink, but what are the modules that are broken down? I know, how long is the course and what are the modules that come with it?
Yeah, great questions. The course is 8 weeks or 8 lectures. However, because I ran it the first time this fall, my students still have access to the course, and it finished almost a month ago. They're just still going through the material. It's pretty big. It's pretty beefy. So module 1 is sort of an overview. Where are we now? Module 2 is actually all about teaching physiotherapists and sport coaches, as well as S&Cs, chiros. Like I have a really wide variety of people taking the course, how to analyze demand of sport through the lens of mechanical load. So they read a few different articles and then they start thinking about the sports that they're involved in. Because I had, people with Snowboard Canada, for example, that were in the last course, and people from basketball. So you need to know basketball. You need to understand what are the forces in basketball. So they do some exercises around that. And then we get into the rehab. So module 3 is basically hydrotherapy and blood flow restriction. So we cover that. And then the next module after that is early stage exercise-based rehab, like gym-based stuff. Or we call it land-based, which is a lot of it isn't weight-bearing. So very precise angles the knee needs to be at for an isometric knee extension, because there are precise recommendations. And then what I did was I took a lot of the research in isometrics and layered that on. So if you're doing a HEMA isometric, how long should you be holding that for? Because in the physical therapy literature, they just say do this exercise or 3 sets of 10 of everything. Right. So I went into other areas of sports science to pull what would be the latest and greatest combinations of rest, length of holds, and sets, like volume. I'm a volume girl, so I brought my own flavor to the course in that, like, dude, volume. They're not playing their sport right now. They're just rehabbing. Volume, conditioning. Don't let that slide, not even for a second. Because a lot of times athletes get in the clinic and they start gaining body fat. They start getting weaker because they're doing just the rehab stuff, right? Then we get into mid-stage rehab where now the person can weight bear. And this is where I introduce a gait component approach, which is something that I've invented, full stop. And I'm transparent about it because in the physical therapy literature, it talks about restoring gait. And then my question is, what is gait? Oh, walking? Who cares? How about that? Who cares? So we get them restoring movement in the pool first. So they're doing multi-directional movement at chest deep, working to waist deep, backpedaling, lateral shuffling, karaoke, marching, and marching until they're blue in the face. Because if you can march, you can walk. Like, let's just be honest. If you can march, you can walk. Every track coach, free speed coach knows that. That is control of the pelvis in the frontal plane. We do not want supermodel hips, right? We want some stability there. March, march, march. So they start with marching in the pool, holding onto the pool deck. Then they march freely in the pool. Then we lower the water. Then we get them to the land and they march. They march, they march, they march until they can dribble. Then we start to dribble. We do gear 1, then we do gear 2, then we do gear 3. And I have like this insane dribbling volume that they have to do by the time they're ready to run. And then what does running look like? We just to go right into accelerations. So then we spend a block of time accelerating. So that would be modules sort of 4 through 6 is all that stuff. Stuff they should be doing in the weight room too. I even have a whole Olympic weightlifting breakdown, like start with these movements. You can do muscle cleans, and then you can move to this, and then you can move to this. I'm a big fan of overhead everything, overhead split squats, overhead squats. Can they do these things? No, they can't. Okay, well, still weak as a kitten. Need to improve. Okay, before we move to here, then the later stages is where we get into deceleration training and plyometrics. So with the decels, I use some of your methods, and the jumping and the landing, I use predictable decelerations with entry. So accelerate, decelerate it, and I call it the deceleration zone. So at first in rehab, that deceleration zone is very wide, very long, and they're taking many steps, and we're just teaching them how to address the ground with the foot, what to do with the hips, what to do with the arms, educating the viewers and the people in the course on torso angle. We use a lot of deep tier plyos to build deceleration, and vipers. So I'm a big fan of using vipers or those aqua bag things that people are using to build deceleration mechanics in the frontal plane. I show a bunch of videos and drills on that, tell them to go do their homework, which is try everything. Because again, if you can't do it yourself, don't teach it, right? Even if it's done at an old lady speed, that's okay. Just make sure you can hold the shapes, yada, yada, yada. And then we work all the way to the end, which is going back to the analysis of the sport. Okay, so in soccer, if they do 200 decelerations in a match over that week of training, they better have at least hit 200 decelerations in training. And then I do some work too on like analyzing change of direction and cutting. So some of Tom DeSanto stuff, I've summarized all of his work in the course, at least the stuff I've read. I've probably haven't read everything, and Damian Harper's stuff too.
So this is A to Z. This sounds outstanding, man. I want to go back
Thank
to
you.
school and be taught by you. And
I'm really enjoying it. And I think this is it for me. Like, this is what I want to focus on. Dr. Cronin in New Zealand is trying to convince me to do a PhD in this area, and I'm terrified. So you can.
Hey, let me tell you something. You need to. You'd challenge. You'd love it. Well, I should. I don't want to say you'd love it. Gosh, oh man. 4
yeah,
years,
no, I think I'm going to die.
Yeah, it's not going to be fun. But you have it's the way that you think and the kind of person you are. I think you would love it. I got to give you a huge compliment. That's unbelievable. I will link this to the show notes.
Yeah,
but Carmen,
questions, they can reach out.
Carmen, I'm going to wind you up here, but what about the left to right impulse index? I mean, if it's not 20%, you can't get someone back on the ice. What are your thoughts on the use of? I'm being I'm
Yeah,
joking, of course, and
I know
I'm
you
not
are.
winding you up. But let me ask you this. Everything right now in our field, and I'm not against, I had a conversation with Kevin Neal, a good friend of mine,
Yeah,
and
for
I
sure.
just talked to him,
Legend.
and maybe it's just me, maybe it's just the age that I'm at, where we are in the field. I'm all for technology, guys. I really am. I just worry a little bit that we're too Newtonian in our approach. We confuse clouds with clocks. We over rely on this shit all the time. And if a number 0.071 is more important than your eyes, Carmen, the 0.071 with the dash after it, we're going to go with. Where does technology at all fit in your end stage return to play? Does it, or is it more, hey, I'm looking at through my lens, through my coaching eye? And if so, what the hell is the technology that you're even looking at?
So I finished my course with stating that we're not sure what are the best metrics to use on a force plate.
Yep.
I also appreciate many taking my course do not have access to technology. So I teach
Sure.
the course as if the person is in a physical therapy clinic and then eventually in a gym, just like yours,
Got
right?
it.
Without any tech. So I do teach from that place, but I do talk about the use of force plates. I have force plates in my
Yep.
lab. We are starting to do some outpatient work in its infancy. I'll start with just saying this. One thing that force plates sometimes claim is that, let's say you have an asymmetry just in standing or in squatting, like just squatting, not even leaving the ground, that
Yep.
if you watch the force trace on the screen, it will help you. So I did a little experiment with myself, an N of one, and I watched myself squat and I got worse. As soon as I looked away from the screen and squatted how I've been taught to squat by extremely good weightlifting coaches, I squatted very symmetrically. That was interesting for me. And that's all it was interesting. It was like, okay, I'm not sure because there's a time delay as well between your action and then the force trace picking it up slight, but it's not the same as looking in a mirror, which is that there's no time delay. So I thought that was interesting. I'd be interested to talk to motor behavior people about that, about, that sensory motor contribution. And then I think that there's probably some use for doing things like a single leg drop jump
Yep.
test
Yep.
and looking at, and I'm a novice at using force plates to return athletes to play. So I'm not going to be arrogant or incorrect and say, this is what I'm doing and this is what everybody should do and
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. I struggle a bit with the idea that biomechanists say that a force plate can pick up strategy, because when I think about strategy as a movement coach that uses her eyes and a video camera in slow motion, I'm constantly looking, using maybe coach's eye to capture some angles and positions. I think of that as strategy. And I
Sure.
also think that with strategy of movement, I'm thinking about a kid that I have that I train that just played in the Vanier Cup this past weekend. He's a football player, so wide receiver, and I've trained him for 4 years. And he was a walk-on to the football team at the university I'm at, but then they cut the football program, so he moved over to the other university. And the commentators were saying things like, "Oh, that's so and so. He's not really a great athlete, but I mean, he's not a great athlete,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But he's unconventional in how he moves."
Sure.
I would describe him as a bit janky. And I'm stealing that from a friend of mine. He's a performance coach at UBC. He's a legend of a coach. He's just does hate social media, but he's like probably the best coach I know. And Sam is the kid's name. He's just the way he moves. He like drops his shoulders. He's just a bit
Yeah.
janky. So he's really strong pound for pound. And he does move well when we get him doing things like linear plyometrics and sagittal plane stuff. He's in all my videos. He was a model for them. But it kind of boils down to, okay, then there's the signature of how people move, and does the signature of how they move impact their risk for injury? I don't think we know that yet. And we don't even know, like, if I change how someone moves, let's say that they on a sidestep cut, they plant their outside foot, so their final foot contact is quite a ways outside their base of support, and then their knee goes valgus. If I change it and I get them sidestep cutting without so much displacement, will that lessen their chances of injury? And the second question is, will it change their speed? Like, will it worsen their change of direction ability? And these are things that we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
And so I think the best thing we can do as practitioners is test, collect data, and share.
It's such a good point. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but look, when I asked you this question, it wasn't trying to. We own force plates. We have force plates at our gym. They're a great service. It's a great company. But like you, I have more questions than answers about these. There's 52 metrics. You could spend a whole day on a jump, like a whole day. And you know what? One of your tweets, which is why I got in touch with you, regarded that returned. I don't know what the tweet was, but it talked about asymmetry. And I went back to look at our jumps. I looked at 360 jumps. I posted a blog on it, and I looked at braking impulse index and propulsive.
Yeah.
And look, these are all asymptomatic athletes, no injuries. When you have 20% of your roster with over a 15% impulse index on propulsive input, I don't know the answer to that, by the way, and I'm not claiming I do, but if there's 20% of the roster that has it, how do you use that as a baseline? Do you know? So
yeah, you can't. You can't.
That's the thing, and
you can't. But you'd probably be able to say that of your roster, like over 80% can squat 1.5 times their body weight. You could probably confidently say something like that.
Yeah.
And that's why we have standards in strength now for majority of sports, because we've been testing kids, and we just haven't been doing this for very long.
Sure.
Like commercially using force plates in clinical environments. When I say clinical, clinical means working with people, by the way. It doesn't mean you're a physio or a doctor.
Nope.
Right?
Nope.
So I just think it would be awesome if we could come up with some kind of hub where everybody's sharing. Nobody has to identify the subject, but we just need to know their sex and their age and their sport and their training history. Training history is important.
Yep.
And maybe injury history. And we just start collecting information.
It's so true. And I want to respect your time. I know we're past the hour here, but Dan Pfaff talked about it many years ago to me, and it was a huge aha moment. And I smacked myself right in the head when he told me this. I mean, he could list, 40-yard dash times from 1980s. He's got it's huge longitudinal data over time. And then you start looking at that. The other thing I listened to recently, which was really interesting, and I made this mistake so many times, is local, straight, global, curve, meaning what comes up, must go down. If you look at just such a small slice of something, it's easy to see that, right? But when you take a look at the bigger picture, eventually you're going to see these things, and I'm fixated a lot of times looking at slices and making decisions as opposed to collecting things, having them play out, and then saying, hey, is that even good to be looking at? Or, hey, how did that affect it in the long term? I don't know if that makes any sense. It's the hamster.
No, it does. And I do think you're encouraging people to start with curiosity. Like that's all we should do. And it doesn't matter if what we've just looked at doesn't matter, but that's still information.
Sure.
Because that goes back to our analysis of the problem. If we learn that something doesn't matter, that's very valuable.
So true. So true.
Right? If it doesn't matter, it just doesn't matter. And Joe and I talk, Joe's my friend at UBC. We talk about this stuff all the time. Like we even talk about like the obsession with speed coaching with adolescents. Like it's a bit silly. Like if you teach kids a few basic things, most of them run very well.
Yep.
And you don't need to turn them into track athletes.
Sure.
Well enough to at least play a team sport. Like there isn't the problem in running mechanics that everybody's talking about. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm totally off my rocker, but I might tweak a few things when I'm getting guys ready for a combine, and we just practice the tests.
Yep.
And then some of them test really well. Others, they don't test very well because they're like a super mean defensive end they're bald with a beard, kind of like you, right? And they've got crazy hands and great response time, and they're not very elastic. But whatever. Like I had a guy last year go, and he didn't do well on the 40. I didn't think his testing would be great because he's just not an elastic athlete.
Yeah.
He's mean and he's fast, and he started as a freshman in the CFL, or as a first year athlete. Like, so whatever. Right. It goes back to like, what is performance? Like, can we even profile performance? Which is another podcast topic, but many people are very confident about that. Oh, we can profile.
Not me.
If the guys, me neither. I'm like, I had a coach ask me once, can you do a gold medal profile for our program, for like a wrestling program? Can you write up a gold medal profile based on physical metrics? And I went, no, I can't. Like, so that basically says the people that win gold medals have this speed, this power, this. Like,
There's just too much.
you can't do that. And a good friend of mine's with the Colorado Mammoth in the NLL, right? In lacrosse. And one of my kids just went down there and he made the team. So I was talking to Joel and I said, Joel Rather, I said, so like, how do you train lacrosse guys? Like, I want to learn from you because I train lacrosse guys up here, but I'm curious. I train them kind of like a hybrid of basketball, ice hockey, and football. It's multi-directional movement, blah. He's like, Carm, in my 25 years of working with lacrosse, we still don't have a profile of because you get guys, lacrosse is interesting because you get like attackmen with like a beer gut, but you put a stick in their hands and holy shit.
Look,
like it looks like a wand. It's like magic. And they're just like,
yep.
Boom. It's in behind the back pass and it's in the net. Like they're just so bloody skilled.
Big time. And this is like, I'll give you another example. Like, we have a huge in hockey right now, and I get it, like speed, but some of the best players are not the fastest players.
They're in the right place at the right time.
That's it. And how do you measure that, right? How do you measure that? You can't measure it.
You go watch practice. That's what you do.
Yeah.
So you go watch practice or watch a game. You'll be like, well, that guy, I want that guy on my team.
That's
girl.
Right. The more I get into it, and I don't know, maybe my mind always constantly changes, but I think when I was younger, even recently, like I thought we're putting together this puzzle. It's a puzzle. It's pieces. And the older I get now, the more I think it's more of a mystery. Like the pieces are never going to be complete. You're never going to have the answer. The best you can do is kind of put bumpers around it. You know what I mean? Like,
there's commonalities. There's things that the best do commonly well, collectively.
Yep.
Like if you were to do like a massive survey and then a bunch of tests, even it goes back to the youth problem that we're facing. I had a 10-year-old tells me, yeah, I scored 51 points on the weekend. And I thought to myself, so you're a ball hog. I didn't say that to him. He's 10, right?
That's right.
I didn't say that to this cute little kid, but I thought to myself, what is this? What does this even mean? Does this mean this kid's going to make the NBA? Like, Is this what this means? Like, why are we putting in the fact this kid knows this exact number of points? That he's been told by a coach or the parents that this is what's valued. Can we predict? My point is, can we even predict that this kid will be successful in basketball? Right? Like I watch my kid play and like you work with middle school boys, right? Like sometimes they just check out mentally. They just do, right? It's just part of adolescence and part of an adolescent brain. It's cool. I think it's really interesting, but we don't know. Like my kid, for example, is very athletic. He's fast and he's extremely fit. And I think part of that's genetics. Like my husband was a 400-meter hurdler. He, genetically gifted in those areas. But Jackson can't, like, he doesn't shoot well, right? Like he'll airball it, or his fine motor is kind of behind.
Yep.
And if he goes to attack the rim, it looks like he's a little bit in slow motion. He kind of goes into like perfectionist mode. And it's like, I'm just so curious. Like, I wonder if he'll get better at that stuff, or if that's just like him and his temperament, or his, like, what is it that made LeBron James, or Michael Jordan? And it's in whatever sport, or Wayne Gretzky. Is there, oh, don't specialize. Oh, you should specialize, and on and on and on. But I think we should just make sure that we manage load with kids and that they're happy and they're not mentally ill.
I have to. I'm with you, and I do want to respect your time. I know we're going on, but
we could go on forever.
I could talk with you for hours about this, but I'm a huge LTAD guy, but it's coming to the extremes of both ends of the bell curve to me. It's just and like you get people that everything's a game, curse blocked practice for anybody, and then you've got the other one which you never stop playing the sport for young kids, right? And all models, like this is a long-term athletic development model. It is a model. Models are assumptions of smart people used to make predictions. They're not biblical. They're not like this is in stone. And so much of it's taken. And you know what this is the last thing, sorry, because I don't want to talk, this is your opportunity, but I always try to say, okay, what are the assumptions of that model? And what I've come back to more and more and more is we're taking this this Taylorism approach to complex problems. This Tayloristic approach where you break down, create the science behind it, create timelines, look at the rehabs, timelines, time, and then from there, and then put it in the oven, and then from there you're going to that is not how it works all the time.
No.
And I just wish people, and I'm pointing my thumb to, that's great, be able to understand that model, but what are the assumptions of that model? Tell me those before you tell me what the model is. Anyways.
The person that made that model doesn't have a PhD in the area that model discusses. I don't know if you know that.
I've done some. All right.
Yeah. We'll end with that, but it is a model. I think you're right. And we just need to go back to the principle of individualization, and that's, if we can give some good advice to your readers, it's everybody, although a lot of us do group training.
Sure.
But it's okay in a group to have the 300-pound old lineman do 6 contacts and have the springy wide receiver do 12, and they do the same drill. So there are definitely ways to modify things in a group setting and try to individualize things as best you can, and just keep listening and talking to your athletes. I find that the best rehab and the best coaches, but rehab professionals, coaches, performance people are good communicators in the sense that they really know their athlete. If I ask you, hey, can you tell me about Larry? What a terrible name, by the way. Anyway, you'd be able to say a bunch of stuff that would be useful because you really know that kid, and it's not just about, well, Larry's on the force plates and he has an asymmetry index of 12%. No, it's so true. Yeah, Larry needs a little bit longer warm up than other kids. Larry tends to always show up early, and he seems to rush through drills. Like, those are important intangibles, because as performance coaches, we can help some of these kids with just being a professional. And if they leave and never make the pros, or they never make it to the A team or whatever, they've learned how to be a good teammate. They've learned about being brave. They've learned how to perform in front of other people, which is scary as shit. They've, learned to be respectful. They've learned to be on time. They've learned to be prepared. They've learned how to recover. They've learned how to take care of their bodies. That's it.
Damn right. Excellent.
Right? So keep coaching, everybody.
Darn right. Where can our listeners, Carmen, find more about you?
They can go to coachbott.com is my website. I'm not there, though. You know what I mean? It's a website. So you could go to Instagram. I like Instagram better than Twitter. Twitter people are mean, but I do show up on Twitter every once in a while, drop a bomb, and then leave. Okay, that's what I do.
Our guest today has been Coach Carmen Bott. Carmen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you.